There we
Okay.
go.
Going to broadcast. Going to slides. Actually, first, let me go to Facebook Live.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will get started right at the top of the hour, about 5 more minutes, but thank you for logging on early. We're glad you could join us this morning.
Okay, screen is shared.
Hi, Rohit. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes.
Welcome, everyone. A couple more minutes and we'll get started.
Please let me know if you have any questions about our online master's degrees at Thunderbird. I've posted my contact info in the chat section.
Becca, I'm going to check real quick that I'm live on Facebook. 1 second. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Becca Clark, and I am the recruiter for Thunderbird's online degree programs. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ted Cross, Clinical Assistant Professor of Leadership and Academic Director of our Master of Applied Leadership and Management program. Thank you, Dr. Cross.
Thank you, Becca. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. We'll talk a little bit about generations in the workplace. I often get asked to talk about this topic, and it reminds me of a story. A number of years ago, I was working in a financial firm, and at this financial firm, my boss would always ask me if a problem arose with the brokerage or one of our clients to give them a call. And so I, being barely a millennial, maybe a little bit more Gen Xer, I would, instead of calling, I would write an email to this person. And then my boss would come back and say, did you call and solve that problem? And I would say, yeah, I sent them an email. And my boss would say, I told you to call them. And so I would say, all right, I'll call them. And then I would send a text message like you see on the right-hand side of your screen. Back and forth, eventually I would give them a call. But as a millennial, I couldn't see the sort of purpose in actually calling someone if I could get it solved by email or by text message. And this was definitely a conflict of generational communication styles, my boss being a baby boomer and I being a millennial. And so these types of differences are very important to understand inside and outside of the workplace if we want to be more productive leaders, especially in this ever-changing environment that we're in. Now, it's probably not surprising that I wanted to do text. There's a recent survey that says that 75% of Gen Z and millennials prefer texting over talking to someone. You'll notice that lots of financial institutions and other service providers are having live chat on their websites instead of having people call in, that we can go ahead and use chat. And that's catering to a new demographic of generational change. Usually when I get asked to talk about generations in the workplace, the real question that people are getting at, especially if they're from the baby boom generation, is how do I deal with millennials? Or if they're millennials, how do I deal with baby boomers or Generation Xers, since we're all working close together? And there's no wonder that this comes up. It's, for the first time in history, we have multiple generations in the workplace at the same time. Now, it's not the only time in history that this has happened, but it's one of the first really documented times when we have lots of overlap of multiple generations working in the same organizations at the same time. It used to be, of course, that people would retire sooner. Life expectancy was also shorter, and so that's playing into part of this. And not only was life expectancy shorter, but the number of working years that a person could expect to have were smaller. So now you have longer lifespans, longer work lifespans, and then thus we also know we experienced the Great Recession, which caused many of the older generation to not retire, quote unquote, on time. And so we have a number of generations working together and having to learn to navigate the nuances. Now, overall, when we look at generational theory, and this is from a global perspective, however, I will come back to some more US-centric examples in a minute. Overall, the generational theorists, they categorize these 5 generations as follows on the right-hand side of your screen. So traditionalists, or the silent generation, you may have heard of this, born prior to 1946. Baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964. Generation X, between 65 and 76, and millennials, depending on who you ask, or sometimes termed Generation Y, born between 1980 or 1977 and 1997. And now the post-millennials, or Generation 2020, or sometimes called Generation Z, born after 1997. So these are some general categories just to give us some grounding of what we're talking about. There's not a lot of agreement on how we should define or have cutoffs for the time periods of when people are born. but in general, that helps give us an idea. Now here you can see this is some data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, looking at 5 generations in the workplace and what their predictions are for the number in that generation, number of people in each generation going forward. So in 2005, you see the baby boomers, the green line, made up the most highest percentage of folks in the workplace. 2010, you begin to see millennials in the purple start to catch up. 2015, of course, millennials become the largest population or generation in the workforce. And then by 2020, you start to see generation 2020, or the Z generation, post-millennials, start to have a significant share. And you also see that traditionalists in that yellow, as time moves on, are moving out of the workforce, and generation X remains fairly stable. So we're in a time of flux, not only with multiple generations, but one generation, for example, baby boomers who were in managerial and senior positions, now starting to move out as generation X takes more senior positions, and then eventually millennials. Now let me back up for a minute. Where do we get generational theory from anyways? Many people will credit actually Plato was the first one to start talking about generations and why children or the young generation weren't as smart or motivated as previous generations. And so that's something that's been happening for thousands of years. It's not new. You know, nowadays we might say, oh, the millennials or the Xers or whoever, the Zs, they act this way or that, and we're concerned about it. But that's not anything new. This has been happening for thousands of years. And really, this modern generational theory falls out of Carl Jung's archetypal theories. He was a psychologist, and he categorized different personality types actually into archetypes across different cultures. And then that was taken and really popularized in 1991 by Strauss and Howe. So this whole idea of generations as we kind of see them today, and we talk about them today, is often through this lens of Strauss and Howe in their 1991 book. They argue that generations are shaped by events in formative years. Overall, like I mentioned, there's no agreement on when those dates ranges should be. And sometimes the generalizations we make across different generations don't hold well across cultures, but understanding some of the differences research has found is helpful in being able to function in a multi-generational workplace. So first, let's start with some of these defining events of each generation. And this is from the Pew Center for Research, fairly US-centric here, but it gives us an idea of the kinds of events that might shape a generation. We start in the top left quadrant, you'll see millennials, and they have rank ordered different events by percentage of what is most important in defining their generation. So number 1 event was September 11, 2, the Obama election, 3, Iraq and Afghanistan wars. All the way down, you can see number 6, the Orlando shooting, and 5, tech revolution, and 4, gay marriage, and you can see the rest. Now compare that over to Generation X, fairly similar, except for number 3, it's not the Iraq and Afghanistan war. For Generation X, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, which most millennials are too young to have really remembered. The tech revolution is in their top 4, but it's a little bit higher than it was for millennials. And then I think it's very interesting, number 7, if you look across in millennials, it was Hurricane Katrina, and for Generation X, the Challenger disaster when the space shuttle exploded. Now, baby boomers, again, because it's American-centric, you'll see every generation really being affected by September 11, but then you'll see the different events after that really changing. So we have, for the boomers, the JFK assassination, the Vietnam War, Obama election, and moon landing. Technology is only in the top 6. The silent generation, or the traditionalists as others define it, September 11 again, World War II, number two, JFK assassination, Vietnam War. So we see that there's different events that are happening during the formative years of these different generational cohorts. And as these different events happen, it shapes their worldviews. So let's talk about worldviews a little bit. This is from the Pew Center for Research, both of these graphs, and they're talking on the left-hand side about the wide ideological divide by generation. And so what you see really here is looking at political views within the US by generation. And what I think is most interesting is if you look on to the right-hand side of the graph in the pink and red, you'll see that millennials are not consistently conservative anymore. And they're the least conservative generation of any of the generations. But they also have the largest percentage of mixed views, which is interesting. And then, of course, you can see that the silent generation was more conservative in nature. Also, they had a seemingly higher percentage combined of folks who could consistently be liberal. Now, on the right-hand side of the graph, this other graph over here, this is partisan affiliation. So which political party do folks belong to? And I think that what's most interesting here is starting at the top, if you look at the millennials, as you look actually from bottom to top, boomer, Xer, millennials, and you look at that independent line, which is sort of the grayish gold color, you'll see that independents have skyrocketed from Xers to millennials. So only 35% during the boomer generation were independents. Now Xers 40 and 48 for millennials. You can also see on the right-hand side, that represents the sort of Democratic leaning or Republican leaning tendencies of each of the cohorts. So what this is showing is that there is very different worldviews, especially within the political spectrum, and things seem to be changing particularly drastically between boomers and millennials, as you can see here. Another interesting thing from the Pew research is that we find out about religious affiliation. This is another aspect of worldview amongst the different cohorts. And here you can see, of course, the silent generation. Only 11% of people surveyed in that generation were unaffiliated with a religion. And you compare that down to baby boomers at 17, then Generation X at 23, and millennials at 35% unaffiliated with religion. Now, what that's saying is, if you look at this research, it's not saying that millennials are less spiritually inclined. It's really something about being affiliated with a traditional organized religion. And so we're seeing that millennials are not affiliating with those types of institutions in greater numbers than any other generation that we currently have right now inside the US. Also, you can see that there's the different main Christian and Catholic groups and their breakdown there. I think it's interesting that evangelical Protestants are losing a lot of ground with millennials also. One more aspect of worldview by generation is attitudes and behaviors towards marriage. So if you look at the left-hand side is Pew Research, and on the right-hand side is actually research done by Ernst & Young. And what you'll see on the left-hand side of the graph is this is percentage married when they were 18 to 33, and then the other graph is percent ever married, and this was a snapshot in 2014. So you can see that the silent generation, when they're between 18 and 33, 64% of them were married, and ever married at the same time, 96% of the silent generation. And then all the way, you can see those numbers changing, not so much on the ever married component. So boomers, were only 6% less at 90%. Xers really start to change, and then millennials really drop off. So there's shifting attitudes towards marriage. Stuart Friedman at the Wharton School of Business has also looked into this extensively in his book, where he examines marriage rates in a retrospective survey of Wharton graduates over the last 20 years, and finds that it's not just that millennials don't want to have children. Actually, when they survey millennials do want to have children. They just don't see how it's possible, given that on average, millennials are now predicting to have to work 14 more hours per week than other generations. And they're also saying, hey, I would like to have children someday, but I'm just not really sure how to make it work right now. Also, millennials from the Ernst & Young research on the right-hand side of your screen are much less likely to take a career break after having children than Gen X and boomers. And you can see only 50% of millennials are willing to take a break after having children, which is interesting now that we have many laws within the US and many corporate policies that support leave, paid leave even, for millennials. Now, the next question I usually get about generations beyond worldview. So first we talked about how do different generations see different aspects of culture and forming their own identity. And the next question I get is, well, how do I motivate people? Or in other words, how do I get people to work hard? And how is that different across generations? And this reminds me of another story. A number of years ago, I was working for a technology company. And this technology company provided online solutions for customers who are very busy, and so they didn't have to leave their home. They could do what they needed to do on the computer. Now, this technology company had a very strict no work from home policy. So we were providing remote solutions for people to be more convenient, yet the management, mostly older baby boomers, did not like working from home. They wanted us to come in to a cubicle environment and be in that environment always. Now, as time went on, Generation X and millennials started to push back on that policy. The management loosened that policy a little bit, so they allowed for some working from home. And what they found is as they hired new workers, they could offer them less and less money for a starting salary if they allowed for more flexibility of working from home. And so this was an interesting experiment that I went through in person, seeing how the baby boom generation might differ from the Xers and the millennials on not wanting flexibility in the workplace, but changing policies to accommodate actually saved money and increased productivity. Now, it doesn't always work. I'm not advocating just for this policy, but it helps if you can look at the differences and do some experimentation. So this was something interesting from a global survey by Briesman and Rao, and they found that they surveyed a bunch of different people from many different countries and found that across the globe, becoming a leader and a highlighted leader was important to 61% of Gen Y, that's millennials, 61% of Gen Z, post-millennials, and 57% of Gen X respondents. And so you're seeing that especially millennials and post-millennials are very interested in this idea of becoming a leader in the workplace. And so how can we think of ways to incentivize that? Also, Ernst & Young looked at motivations across these different countries, and they found something interesting about the different generations and who is actually in managerial positions now. So you can see the different countries. Take India in the upper left-hand corner, for instance. Millennials hold 85% of the managerial positions, followed by X and then boomers. And then you see in China something different. Generation X is ahead in the managerial positions. Japan follows a similar sort of demographic distribution as India. And then look at the US. You're seeing that 39% of millennials, 37% of Generation X, and 35% of boomers are in actual managerial positions. So you see a much more equal distribution in the US. However, globally, 62% of millennials manage the work of others. So millennials are beginning to be in managerial positions. Generation X has taken a strong hold in that in many countries, and there's still frankly, a lot of boomers who are in managerial or director level positions. Another finding from Bresman and Rao is that Generation Y and X are more enthusiastic or more open to coaching and mentoring when they get a promotion to a management job, over and beyond the idea of higher responsibility. So Generation Y, millennials, and X are saying we love the coaching and mentoring aspect of being promoted into a management job. They're not as interested in feeling prestigious about having higher responsibilities. But then when you look at Generation Z, they are citing responsibility as something that they're very interested in, gaining more responsibility and having more freedom. And so you're seeing different motivations for why people would want to move into managerial positions according to cohort of generation. Now, this was an interesting question. The question for this survey was, what do you want in a job? And if you look from the bottom to the top is really how you'll see how the different generations ranked different aspects. So competitive pay at the bottom is important to everyone, equally important to boomers and Generation X, less important to millennials. And then working with colleagues, including boss, and having a supportive sort of culture to meet professional and personal goals is very important to Xers, second to millennials, and third to boomers. And then I only go to the next one. Being able to work in a flexible environment, but still be on track for promotion. So it's not just that folks want flexibility; they want to know that it's not going to put them behind if they are being flexible in their work arrangement. That they won't be penalized for that. And it's very important to Xers, very important to millennials. I think it's interesting that of course pay and benefits is still the most important to all three cohorts, but flexibility is starting to really creep up on the scale also. Here's another just quick look here of some generalizations about how to motivate the different cohorts inside the workplace. And I'm only going to go through just the top line of each of these, but traditionalists, so that's what we're calling the silent generation, are more motivated by money, but they also want to be respected. Okay, there's something about being respected, and you might have encountered some problems in the workplace when you saw maybe a Generation X or a millennial not giving a traditionalist the respect they feel they deserve, and that can cause some contention. Baby boomers, on the other hand, prefer monetary rewards and flexibility, and also are worried about retirement, right? The Great Recession has really put a damper on a lot of people's retirement plans, and so how can we help them catch up? Generation X values bonuses and stock as monetary rewards. Also, they want flexibility as a non-monetary reward. So they feel that if they can earn the trust of their managers, their bosses, their directors, they should be able to have some flexibility. Millennials, they're separating here Generation Y and Z. They want stock options, which I thought was very interesting, as well as feedback as a non-monetary reward. So how am I doing in my job? This is one of the reasons probably us millennials are often seen as needy, is because we really want constant feedback to make sure that we are on track. Generation Z is interested in social rewards more than money often, and is motivated by meaningful work. So how does what we're doing in the workplace connect to a larger purpose? Now, the last aspect I want to talk about the generations is we've gone through worldview. We've talked a little bit about motivations across the different cohorts. And now I want to talk a little bit about behaviors. I really always say believe what people do and buy, not say. So when we do survey research, people will say lots of different things and we'll think that's interesting. But what can we see in some of the behaviors of the different generations? So this a lot of this research in this section actually comes from Goldman Sachs. They've pulled from lots of different sources, but they have a great a great website that just covers the research they pulled together on millennials and the different cohorts and how they differ. And this graph is showing, do you play video games? Millennials at 50%, and then really drops down to 25% for Generation X, and boomers hardly at all, 15% play video games. So that's a very different behavior from generation to generation. Also, in buying or renting homes, I thought this was very interesting. This is percentage of renters who plan to buy a home someday. So this is when they ask, okay, do you want to buy a home? Are you planning on it? The younger folks, 93% say, yes, I want to buy a home someday. And then you'll see that if you're renting and you're older, you're less likely to say, I want to buy a home someday. So it's really a hope of young people who are renting to buy a home. And if you're older and renting, not so much. Now this is interesting to sort of contrast with the percentage of renters in contrast to the total population. So in 2005, only 52% of the whole population was renting homes in the US. And in 2013, and it's now greater, 60% were. Now, this also goes along with the graph on the right-hand side from the Pew Research Center that shows the percentage of adults 18 to 31 married and living in their own household. So if in 1968, over 58% or 55% of 18 to 31-year-olds were married and living their own household, when they surveyed 18 to 31-year-olds in 2012, only 25% were married and living in their own household. I wanted to end talking about millennial purchasing behavior because it's bringing about a lot of new things such as Airbnb. It's bringing about things such as Uber and Lyft. This idea of a sharing economy rather than an ownership economy. And this is from Goldman Sachs on the left-hand side. And I love this Jeremy Rifkin quote, 25 years from now, car sharing will be the norm and car ownership an anomaly. So millennials are more interested in access to really nice stuff, whether that's renting a nice apartment, leasing, or car sharing, or even, as you might have seen, there's now sharing or rental businesses for, hobby equipment such as woodworking, or you see all these subscription services for, now the newest one is these movie passes where you pay a subscription fee every month and you can watch so many movies at the theater. There's also a burgeoning sort of scene of private clubs that you must buy a membership to. You're seeing millennials focus more and more on fitness and the rise of the fitness industry and CrossFit gym memberships and those types of things. So I think it's interesting to look at these behaviors that as the Xers and millennials begin to sort of take over the lion's share of purchasing power, you're seeing them shift towards, especially in the millennial generation, to access rather than ownership. Now, we've gone through worldviews, we've gone through the idea of different motivational factors and different behaviors for each generation, but I have to leave you with the caveat that you can't categorize everyone. We're making some generalizations. A lot of those are US-centric. They don't always hold across the globe. And the real question is, are you curious enough as a leader to tolerate difference, suspend belief, and learn about others? That's the key. When people ask me, well, how do I work with different generations? The real key is, are you willing to recognize difference, stop for a moment, and not say, well, they're just wrong because they're doing it differently, and learn from others? If you are interested in those kinds of things, you'd likely be a good fit for our online Master of Applied Leadership and Management, where we learn how to lead across different organizational types and different generations, how to use leadership skills to convince and persuade rather than using top-down leadership. And our program's 30 credits. We offer it online, and we offer it at accessible price points and have scholarship for folks who live in emerging market countries. I thank you all for joining me today, and I would love to take some questions, Becca, if we have time.
Yes, we do have time for some questions. If you will please post those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Dr. Cross will answer those live. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you'll join us next month for the Science of Happiness 2.0 on August 23rd at the same time. We will be posting these slides, sending you the slides and the video recording early next week for those of you who missed a portion or would like to see it again.
Looks like we have a few questions. Becca, can you read those to me?
I'm not seeing any questions yet, but I'm sure they're coming in.
Let me see if I can see them.
Oh, here we have one from Colleen from Jamaica. Does the data disaggregate between men and women between the generations?
It does, and you can drill down, especially if you look at the Pew Research Center on their generational cohort research. It'll show the differences between men and women. One interesting thing that, just an example, that Stuart Freeman found in his Wharton Work-Life Integration Project, and you can look that up, it's the Wharton Work-Life Integration Project, is that men and women are starting to have more similar views about family and career in the younger generations than they did in previous generations, even though they might be holding off having a family because of work. And also there's some flip-flop when they looked at perceptions by women graduates. They found that it used to be that in older cohorts, women felt guilty about having a career and having a family. And now younger women are feeling the opposite, that they're feeling guilty if they want to just be a stay-at-home mom and not have a career. And so there's some changes there in perceptions and some different ways that you can, but it does change a little bit, definitely among genders.
Why do you think flexibility and working from home has been a priority for younger generations?
I think it has a lot to do with the younger generations wanting more autonomy, more freedom. So often it's less about the place where you're working, but the ability to choose the place where you're working, whether that's a coffee shop, whether that's in the office or from home. I also think that younger generations are finding that there's less and less big blocks of free time. We're constantly interrupted by work from our smartphones and our computers and all those things. And so as a trade-off, younger generations are asking for flexibility in place and want to be more focused on managers who are results oriented rather than sort of face-to-face time oriented. Not that face-to-face time isn't important, but rather that millennials want more flexibility and want to be measured by outcomes, not just by being there in person.
Antonia asks, what if you don't fit as Gen X or Y, but in between? What does the data say about that population?
Yep. So there is actually a new micro cohort or micro generation that they're identifying. They don't really have a name, haven't landed on a good name yet, but I would fit into that same generation, someone who was born in 1980 that straddles sort of the divide between Generation X and Generation Y or millennials. And what they're finding is that we grew up in an analog childhood and came into technology later. And what they're finding out is that we have some characteristics of Generation X and the independence, and some of the Generation X also is often seen to have a little more edge to them, if you will. But we have also the optimism of the millennials, and so there is research on that. If you look up if you look up in Google the cohort that straddles X and Y, you'll find more on that topic.
Great. Katie asks, do you find that young CEOs are interested in hiring employees over 50? The generation gap in the workplace is quite pronounced right now. Would like to hear your comments.
Yeah, I think that there is a problem. I think that there is age discrimination, especially in technology companies. We've heard lots in the news about gender disparities in technology companies and in the STEM world. But also, I think that what we're also starting to see is that older workers who want to change careers and come into a new industry or a different company in the same industry are often having to overcome ageism to be able to land those spots. I think of that great movie, if you haven't seen it, called The Intern, where there's a young technology CEO. You know, she's a millennial, and this older gentleman applies for an internship and gets it at her company. And she doesn't really see the value in him until at the end, where she sees, wow, this could be someone who has already done a lot of the things that I have done and can really help mentor us. So I think younger generations need to understand that there's a lot of wisdom to be imparted, and there's a lot of value in mentorship, even if the Xer or the millennial is in a higher position at the organization. How can they draw on the wisdom and expertise and experience of the silent generation and of older baby boomers?
Excellent. That's all the questions I have. If you have a question, please log it in on the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen.
We'll stay on for just a few more minutes, so go ahead and get your last questions in.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. We hope to see you next month. Dr. Cross does these webinars once a month.
Thank you all, and we'll see you next month.